The road to nowhere. My job often required me to travel through remote areas of the country. Long hours on the road had become a part of my life. The landscapes were familiar, yet ever-changing, offering a mosaic of natural beauty. But there was one experience that I'll never forget, a story that still gives me nightmares. I was driving through a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of the night, my mind lost in thought, when I spotted a solitary figure standing by the side of the road. A young man, perhaps in his late 20s, looking desperate and disheveled. A hitchhiker. Compassion overrode my caution, and I pulled over. He was grateful for the ride, explaining that he'd been stranded for hours. His name was Tom, and he was heading to the next town over, coincidentally, right on my route. We settled into an easy conversation, discussing our lives and travels. As the night wore on, Tom's demeanor began to change. He grew quiet, his eyes darting nervously around. I asked if everything was all right, and he hesitated before asking me a strange question. "Have you ever been on a road that doesn't end?" he asked, his voice trembling. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his eyes were wide with genuine fear. "A road that doesn't end?" I repeated, confused. "A road that goes on forever, looping back on itself, trapping you," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was on that road once. I don't know how I escaped. I think it's following me." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I assured him he was safe now. Perhaps he had been lost, or maybe the loneliness of the road had played tricks on his mind. The conversation shifted to more mundane topics, but Tom's words lingered in my thoughts. Hours later, we approached the town where Tom was heading. He thanked me for the ride and asked to be dropped off at a crossroad, pointing to an old dirt road that veered off the highway. As I pulled over, he turned to me, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else. A trace of sadness, perhaps even pity. "Take care, friend," he said, gripping my hand. "And remember, if you ever find yourself on a road that doesn't seem to end, turn back before it's too late." He climbed out of the car and walked down the dirt road, disappearing into the darkness. I shook off the eerie feeling and continued my journey, thinking little of Tom's strange warning. Several days later, while driving through another remote area, I encountered a roadblock. A landslide had made the main highway impassable, and I was directed to a detour. The detour took me onto a narrow, winding road that snaked through dense forest. The scenery was beautiful, yet oddly unsettling. As the hours ticked by, I realized something was wrong. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no signs of towns or other vehicles. The same landmarks appeared again and again: a twisted tree, a distinctive rock formation, a bridge over a dried-up creek. Panic began to set in as Tom's words echoed in my mind. A road that doesn't end. I attempted to turn back, but the road seemed to loop in on itself, leading me back to the same spots over and over again. Desperation took over, and I abandoned the car, venturing on foot, hoping to find a way out. But the road had me in its grasp, twisting and turning, leading me back to where I started. Time lost meaning. Was it days? Weeks? I wandered the endless road, driven to the brink of madness. Then one night, in a moment of clarity, I remembered Tom's parting words. "Turn back before it's too late." With newfound determination, I reversed my path, walking backward, refusing to acknowledge the road's illusions. Slowly but surely, the landscape began to change. The looping landmarks vanished, replaced by unfamiliar sights. Exhausted and disoriented, I finally stumbled onto a highway, collapsing by the side of the road. A passing driver found me and took me to safety. My car was never recovered, and the road I had been trapped on seemed to vanish from maps. Some say I was lost, confused, a victim of isolation and fatigue. But I know what I experienced. I was on a road that didn't end. A road that defied logic and reason. A road that Tom had warned me about. As you sit by this campfire, remember my tale. The open road is filled with wonders and mysteries. Some beautiful, some terrifying. If you ever find yourself on a road that seems to loop endlessly, heed Tom's warning. Turn back before it's too late. The road to nowhere is out there, waiting, and once it has you, it may never let go. The ride of a lifetime. Many years ago, when I was young and adventurous, I took to hitchhiking. The open road called to me, and I eagerly explored the country, meeting new people and seeing new places. Hitchhiking had its risks, but it was a different time back then, and the thrill was intoxicating. One night I found myself stranded on a desolate stretch of highway, miles from the nearest town. The sky was overcast, and the moon hid behind thick clouds. The wind howled, sending chills down my spine. After hours of waiting, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over me as the car pulled over. The driver was an older gentleman, kind-eyed with a gentle smile. He introduced himself as Edgar and offered me a ride to the next town. Grateful, I climbed into the passenger seat, eager to escape the chill of the night. We fell into easy conversation. Edgar was a retired schoolteacher, traveling the country to visit family and old friends. He spoke eloquently, sharing stories of his students and his passion for literature and poetry. As we drove, I noticed something peculiar about the car. The interior was immaculate, filled with an intoxicating fragrance I couldn't place. The dashboard was adorned with an old photograph of a beautiful young woman, her eyes filled with sorrow. I asked about the photograph, and Edgar's face grew somber. He explained that the woman was his late wife, who had tragically died in a car accident many years ago on this very road. They had been young and in love, their entire lives ahead of them, but fate had other plans. He spoke of her with such affection and longing that it brought tears to my eyes. We drove in silence, lost in thought, the haunting beauty of his words lingering in the air. As the miles rolled by, the landscape began to change. The road became narrow and twisted, flanked by ancient trees that loomed over us like dark sentinels. The air grew heavy, and a strange unease settled over me. Edgar's demeanor changed as well. He grew quiet, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I asked if everything was all right, but he merely shook his head, a distant look in his eyes. "We are nearing the place," he said, his voice trembling. "The place where she died." He began to recite a poem, his voice filled with emotion. It was a haunting verse about love and loss, a lament for a life cut short. As he spoke, the car's headlights illuminated a sharp bend in the road, and for a brief moment, I saw something that made my heart stop. A ghostly figure, a woman, standing by the side of the road, her eyes filled with infinite sadness. I cried out, but when I looked again, she was gone. Edgar pulled the car over, his face pale and drawn. He looked at me, his eyes filled with understanding, and I knew he had seen her too. "She comes to me on this night every year," he said, his voice breaking, "a reminder of what was lost." We sat in silence, the weight of what we had witnessed settling over us. Finally, Edgar started the car, and we continued our journey. The road straightened, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. We reached the next town, and Edgar dropped me off at a motel, his eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you, my friend," he said, gripping my hand. "You've given me something precious tonight, a connection, a shared experience. I will never forget it." He drove away, leaving me standing by the side of the road, my mind reeling from what had transpired. I spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by the image of the ghostly woman and Edgar's heartfelt words. The next morning, I sought information about the accident, hoping to understand what had happened. The local librarian, after some digging, found an old newspaper article. It detailed a tragic accident, a young couple, Edgar and his wife, killed on that winding road. I read the article again and again, my hands shaking. Edgar and his wife had died together, their lives cut short by a twist of fate. I had ridden with a ghost. I never saw Edgar again, but his words and the haunting image of his wife stayed with me. A poignant reminder of love, loss, and the mysteries of the road. And so as we sit by this campfire, remember that the open road is filled with wonders and secrets, some beautiful, some terrifying. Hitchhiking may bring you face to face with strangers, but sometimes those strangers may not be of this world. Sometimes they may offer you the ride of a lifetime, a ride you'll never forget. The Red Ribbon. It all started on a gloomy evening when my car unexpectedly ran out of gas on a lonely stretch of highway. I was traveling back home after visiting family, and I had figured I could make it to the next gas station. But I was wrong. I remember the chilling gust of wind that swept over me as I stepped out of my car. The clouds hung low, and twilight was settling. The atmosphere was eerie, to say the least. Having seen many horror movies, I hesitated at the thought of hitchhiking, but the desolation of my surroundings convinced me otherwise. I had no choice. After what felt like hours, a pair of headlights emerged from the horizon. The vehicle slowed down as it approached, and I could see it was an old-fashioned black car with an intricate design. The windows were tinted, adding to the vehicle's mystery. The car halted beside me. The window rolled down, revealing a woman, seemingly in her late 20s. She wore a thick red ribbon around her neck. Her pale face was a stark contrast to her dark hair and the deep shade of her lipstick. But it was her eyes that drew me in, an intense shade of green that felt both inviting and intimidating. "Need a ride?" she asked, her voice soft and melodious. I hesitated, taking in her appearance, but her friendly smile made me lower my guard. "Yes, thank you," I replied. I got in, and the car resumed its journey. We made casual conversation, where I was headed, why I was on the road so late, and so on. Her name was Lila. As the miles passed, I couldn't help but notice that the atmosphere inside the car grew colder. Lila remained composed, her hands firm on the steering wheel, her red ribbon occasionally catching my eye. Feeling a need to break the increasing tension, I pointed to her ribbon and asked, "That's a unique choice of accessory. Any particular reason you wear it?" Lila's smile waned, and she glanced at me with those piercing eyes. "It holds my life together," she whispered. I chuckled, assuming it was some poetic or metaphorical statement. But Lila remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road. Trying to shake off the unease, I focused on the car's radio. Static filled the air, and I reached to adjust it. Just then a voice, barely audible, whispered from the static, "Beware the ribbon." Startled, I pulled my hand back. Lila had heard it too. She turned off the radio and sighed. "It seems you're meant to know," she murmured. I gulped. "Know what?" She looked straight into my eyes. "Many years ago, I hitchhiked on this very road. A stranger took advantage of my vulnerability and took my life. He slit my throat and left me for dead." I froze, every ounce of blood draining from my face. She continued, "But I had unfinished business, a strong will to live. I roamed these roads, searching for a way to communicate, to reach the land of the living again. This ribbon," she touched it gently, "is the only thing holding my severed head in place." My heart raced. The logical part of my brain screamed that it was absurd, but the atmosphere in the car, the whisper from the radio, and Lila's intensity made doubting her difficult. She smiled sadly. "I don't mean you any harm. I just want company, someone to talk to, even if for a little while." The car ride felt endless. Every second was agonizing. I was trapped with someone or something that was beyond the realm of the living. Finally, the car stopped at a gas station. "Here you are," Lila said. "Fill your car up and get home safely." As I stepped out, overwhelmed by the surreal experience, Lila called out, "Remember, not every hitchhiker has good intentions. Be careful out there." I nodded, speechless. By the time I filled a canister with gas and reached my car, Lila was gone. I've never hitchhiked since that day, nor have I offered a ride to anyone. The fear of whom or what I might encounter holds me back. Every time I drive down a lonely highway and the wind howls past, I think of Lila and her red ribbon, a grim reminder of the thin boundary between life and the afterlife. The Phantom Road. A long time ago, when I was a brash young man, I embarked on a cross-country road trip. Armed with nothing but a rusty car, a map, and a thirst for adventure, I was eager to explore the open roads and endless possibilities. It was the third night of my journey, and I was driving through a barren stretch of highway in the heart of the Midwest. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the landscape was dark and lifeless. My car's radio was playing static, unable to catch a clear signal. The road seemed to stretch forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt, lined with nothing but fields and shadows. Then I saw him, a solitary figure, standing by the side of the road, his thumb outstretched. A hitchhiker. My initial reaction was to drive past. It was late, and the idea of picking up a stranger on a lonely road was far from appealing. But as I approached, something made me reconsider. Perhaps it was the loneliness of the road or the understanding of what it feels like to be stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over and the man climbed in. He was middle-aged, with a ragged beard and eyes that seemed to hide some deep sadness. His clothes were worn, and he carried a battered old suitcase. "Thank you, friend," he said, his voice soft and weary. "I've been waiting a long time." We exchanged small talk, and I learned that his name was Henry. He was traveling to a small town not far from my route. As we drove, he told me stories about his life, filled with travels, love, and loss. His words were poetic, filled with wisdom and longing. The road seemed to take on a surreal quality as we drove. The landscape became more twisted, the trees gnarled and leaning over the road, like ancient sentinels watching our passage. The night grew darker, the shadows thicker. Then Henry's stories took a dark turn. He spoke of a road, a phantom road that only appears to those lost and desperate, a road that leads nowhere, trapping the traveler in an eternal loop. "They say it's a cursed road," Henry said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Once you enter, you can never leave. You'll drive forever, lost and alone, until madness takes you." I laughed nervously, dismissing it as a ghost story, but Henry's eyes were serious. "Watch for the signs," he warned. "A fork in the road, a dead tree, a raven perched on a branch. Turn back if you see them." We drove in silence after that, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The road felt endless, and I realized I hadn't seen another car or any sign of civilization in hours. A chill crept up my spine. Was this the phantom road Henry spoke of? Then I saw it. The fork in the road, just as Henry described, and beyond it, the twisted silhouette of a dead tree. Perched on a branch was a raven, its eyes gleaming in the dark. Panic gripped me. I slammed on the brakes, turning to Henry, but the seat beside me was empty. His suitcase was gone. I was alone. My heart pounded as I reversed the car, tires screeching, desperate to escape the phantom road. The dead tree loomed in my rearview mirror, the raven watching, silent and judgmental. I drove without stopping until I reached the next town, shaken and disoriented. I found a motel and spent the night unable to shake the feeling that I had brushed against something unnatural, something beyond my understanding. The next morning, curiosity drove me to investigate the story of the phantom road and the mysterious hitchhiker. What I found chilled me to the bone. A local historian told me the story of a man named Henry who had died on that stretch of highway decades ago. He had become a legend, a ghostly figure who would hitch rides, guiding lost travelers away from the phantom road. Others had seen the signs, the fork, the tree, the raven, but not everyone had heeded the warning. Some were found, their cars abandoned, their minds shattered. Others were never seen again, lost to the phantom road, condemned to drive it forever. As I sit by this campfire, retelling this story, I can still see Henry's sad eyes, hear his warning. The memory haunts me, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, roads that lead to nowhere, and ghosts that guide us for reasons we may never understand. Remember my tale the next time you find yourself on a lonely road late at night, and if you see a hitchhiker by the side of the road, or a fork, or a dead tree, or a raven perched on a branch, heed the warning. For the phantom road is out there waiting, and once you enter, you may never leave.